Well, are banks safe? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, if you got a question for me, I've got an answer for you. Just go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com. We'd love to help you out. You can send in an email and tell me what your question is. We'll get you an answer back. You need a resource, we'll point you in the right way, the right direction, that's all at prudentmoney.com. You know, today we're going to be looking at a big part of most people's financial lives, big part of the overall financial system in the United States, and that is today's banking system. When you start talking about the crisis of banks, and you know the way, depending on who you listen to, where you get your information, a lot of people will talk about the upcoming crisis at banks. You start thinking about what happened in 2008 and 2007. And you start thinking about all the banks that shut down. And we're going to talk a little bit about this because I get the question about, you know, where's a good bank that I feel comfortable with, that I feel safe with and secure, I can move my money to. I'm just looking to change banks. Get that question a lot. I think a lot of people are thinking about that. They're looking at areas of their lives and saying, you know, this is probably not the most secure feeling that I could have about who I bank with and where I leave my money. So, you know, the answer to that is, you know, you can give an answer. This is what I would suggest. This is what I would look for. But here's what you also have to know. And we're going to talk about that, what you have to know, as during today's program. First, I like to start, though, here lately, with an update of what is happening in the war with Iran. I think it's important to keep up with that. And, you know, there's a lot of bickering going back and forth. Over the weekend, President Trump said we're not going to take a 15-hour plane ride to meet with Iran when they're not settled in on what they're going to negotiate with. They're not going to accept. So when they're ready to accept what we have on the table, they're ready to talk, they can call us. And so what's interesting is that, you know, here and there during the weekend, we heard more about how they're wanting to do a deal, how they're excited about accepting some of the points that President Trump has laid out on the table. Then you go to some of the Iranian news media, and they have a total opposite story to tell, and they're not, you know, one was this morning, they were talking about how President Trump wants to desperately talk to get this thing put to bed, not their words, but mine, put to bed because they haven't achieved anything. And that is somewhat true. But at the end of the day, who knows? All I know is that there's a lot of spin happening, and there's a lot of talk that our government, their government wants you to believe. Who knows who's telling the truth and who's not? So we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think here's the bottom line, and what you've got to realize as an investor. And I've gotten more and more calls from people who have been writing the market up and looking at it and going, this just is not sustainable. But here's the realization of it. Risk, as we know it as investors, is at the extreme. And you have the total, you know, let's look at it as a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you have this taking place. At the other, you have this taking place. And it's going to, you know, the way this plays out, it's going to probably be one or the other. And at one spectrum, end of the spectrum, you have the President Trump negotiation, as he always seems to get taken care of, the negotiation, win the negotiation, capture, but becomes being successful, everything works out like he's promised and predicted it would. Then you have, on the other side of the spectrum, you got a very stubborn Iran who is very committed to an ideology. And I think what we don't realize and what the media doesn't pick up on is their confidence of going forward, their ability to live without. I mean, it's a totally different type of culture. And although the White House says we've taken out all these various aspects of their military, somehow they're magically coming up with more resources. So once again, who knows what the reality of it is. But we have two opposite ends of the spectrum, and you really have to choose how you're going to take your risk. And I realize that I'm talking a lot about this, but I want to make sure that you understand this isn't just a normal day at the beach or a normal day at the office. I mean, this is extreme risk. And if you don't pick the right one, you might really regret it. I'm not trying to be over sensationalize this, what we're about to talk about. I mean, I'm really, you look at this, you look at a lot of the cards that are on the table, you look at the consumer, I think it's the consumer reports came out today, all-time historic low. And, today's consumer confidence is just not there. And that does not bode well for the economy. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the indicators still saying that things don't look good. You look at the price of oil. I mean, even if this whole thing was resolved today, it's not going to turn around on a dime. I mean, you've got to know that. You've got to know there is a lot of risk built up. And just know that as you're thinking about how do I take my investments and put them in the right type of portfolio. So we have the ultimate showdown, the extreme worst case scenario, extreme best case scenario, and a lot of sensationalism. Now, let's get to banks and talk a little bit about that so we make sure we get through this by the end of the program. The question that I get a lot is, I'm banking at XYZ Bank. I really want to move. I'm not happy with them. Or I'm in a bank that's a small regional bank, and I don't have the biggest set of. I have confidence with them. I want to go to a bank that I feel good about, feels that secure, whatever that means, and that sort of thing. Now, if you are in the doom and gloom economy, which I would say that we are, where you have a lot of people selling newsletters, selling books, and wanting you to believe a certain thing is happening, banks are just a great target because you can always reference back to the banking crisis of the 2008 financial crisis. It's an easy target. Then you can talk about Wells Fargo and Bank of America, two really consumer-based banks that have ripped off a lot of people. Remember the days when we went from one Wells Fargo story to another Wells Fargo story, just with disbelief that how could a bank rip off their consumers and do it over and over and over again and get fined. And it's just, from identity theft to opening credit card accounts in their banking, their customers' names. It just is unreal, very unreal. So you have a lot of information sitting out there, and then you've got the gloom and doom microphone that is telling you, predicting what's going to happen, and talking about statistics that they're reading and putting their spin on the particular statistics. So one of the recent data from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, says this: about 60 banks are on the FDIC's problem bank list, which is often called the troubled bank list. Now, you probably, the first thing that comes to your mind, I would think, is that, boy, hope my bank isn't on that list, because that's the last place that I would want to be, that I would want to have my money. So these are banks that show significant weakness. And the list of those banks is, for good reason, is confidential. The FDIC does not publicly name the banks, which I get that. I think that's reasonable. The 60 banks represent roughly, get this, 1.4% of all FDIC-insured banks, which is considered a nominal, non-crisis level. Here's a perspective. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and we're talking about 60 banks, the list exceeded 300 banks. So today's level is relatively small. And I think I remember, I've got so many notes sitting here in front of me. Here's just recently, 2 banks failed. You know, we're talking about banks that went into insolvent, had to be taken over. 2 banks failed in 2025. Only 1 bank has failed this year. This is probably a great spot to take a break. We'll do that real quick and get back to this information. This is Bob Brooks. You're listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Stick around. I'll be right back. Hello, this is Bob Brooks. Proverbs 22:3 and Proverbs 27:12 are the exact same verse word for word. I call them the stewardship verses of risk. A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. On the Prudent Money Radio Show, we teach about risk, how to identify it, how to figure it out, and what to do about it. We believe that to be a prudent steward, you have to be a good risk manager. Listen to the Prudent Money Radio Show on Bible School Radio 91.3. Prudent Money, home of the modern-day steward movement.
Dynamic, practical, life-changing.
There's no point in going to church and not letting the Christ who gave birth to the church on the day of Pentecost change your life.
Join us each day as Pastor Paul Shepherd applies the timeless truth of Scripture to everyday life. It's Destined for Victory on this great station.
Weekday afternoons at 3:30 here on Bible School Radio, KDKR.
This is Rob Randall, your host and teacher of the Invisible War radio program. The Invisible War is the study of God's Word on how to walk in Christ's victory in the spiritual battles we face against the powers of darkness. Join me every Sunday morning at 9 right here on KDKR and KYJC in Commerce, your station for life.
Welcome back. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you got a question for me, please go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com. Send it in. We will get you taken care of. I'd love to get your emails and love to hear what is going on. So just go to the website, which is prudentmoney.com. Go to the top of the page, click through to Ask Bob, and send it in. We'll get you taken care of. That's all at prudentmoney.com. So here's a perspective. Well, let me back up. That's somewhat, I think, gives you a good look at what the situation is today. Now, I want to make sure that you're following what the gloom and doom business is putting out there. It says, the FDIC list of troubled banks is increasing, and that is a problem for everyone. Remember, we're at 1.8% of all FDIC banks are on this troubled bank list. He says this one piece that he wrote, the FDIC list of troubled bank is growing. Now the names of these banks are withheld from the public. Now, here's, the way that this is written. Listen to how this is written. Now, the names of these banks are withheld from the public. So the takeaway from that is that it used to be the names of these banks are disclosed. The names of these banks have never been available to the public. And then he goes on to say, in fact, the FDIC has even stopped disclosing the total assets of the banks on the list. The total assets of the banks on this list are not published either. Not in the way that this writer is insinuating they should be. Saying that publishing that information could lead the public to identify a troubled institution and possibly trigger a disorderly bank run. So now, this is the gloom and doom. The FDIC reports only the number of banks on the list. Seriously, when will people say enough? The public has no need to know those names. Now, I get it. You're probably saying it. I mean, think about it. If you found out your bank today was on the troubled bank list, that the FDIC, which is the insurance of the banking system, the very kind of the first thing that you would maybe consider doing is yanking your money out of there. I think that's the biggest fear one of the biggest fears. I'll say it that way of the federal government is to have a major bank run, because that's at that point. You have there's been a failure in confidence of the banking system, and it all goes down from there. I mean, the things that could happen because of that, it would really truly be unbelievable. So it says, and the FDIC does release this information every quarter. The FDIC's public bank list has risen from 57 to 60 banks, in bold, in one quarter, and that is significant. I just don't see where you can, if you look at the overall stakes. Now, if that is the beginning, I mean, it's an over-sensationalized point. It's added 3 banks in a quarter. Now, if it continues and adds more and more and more and more, yeah, you've got a point. But this is more of this should be more of an FYI than a gloom and doom prediction and of what's happening. It says the entire banking system, the entire financial system, functions in a black hole. It's insolvent and completely dependent on the constant influx of more debt pumped into the system exponentially, just to maintain the illusion of normalcy. What they're basically saying is they're depending on the government to print money, and they create debt to make it all work. That's been that way for a very long time. What we have is a debt-based banking financial system running out of road. There is no other way to look at this. You see, there is the problem. There is other ways to look at it. And a system built in on ever-expanding debt illusion, confidence in con jobs is the last and final pillar. And when that breaks, everything else follows. And that's all that he wrote. Now, remember, he's making an awfully major point about what's happening in the system, and that they no longer disclose the bank's names. Well, they never did that really to begin with. They don't tell how big the banks are, but they really don't do that to begin with. I mean, when a bank it becomes insolvent, and I remember back during the financial crisis that one of the things I always did on a Friday and I know you're probably thinking, could you just get a life, Bob? I'd go home and I'd pull up the FDIC insolvency list to see which banks are being taken over right then there on a Friday. They always seem, I guess this is protocol, they always seem to shut these banks down on a Friday. I don't remember what the name, I think it was First Republic, and there was about 2 or 3 banks, and if my memory serves me, and this was back I think in 2023. I shouldn't look this up. I should have. My bad. 2023 that you had one First Republic went insolvent, and you had 2 others over the weekend. And I vaguely remember, I know that the first bank that was insolvent turned up being a J.P. Morgan branch bank literally by that next Monday. And what any of these other banks had the assets replaced. And what never really even hit the mainstream media was that these banks, nobody lost any money. All the depositors were made whole. And in fact, I think that that's not necessarily something they want to disclose. And but it was very obvious because nobody was talking about it. The assumption is that was the case. And they're talking about a crisis being formed because 2 banks went on the troubled bank list. And that doesn't, once you get the troubled bank list, that doesn't sign your death certificate by any stretch. I mean, there's a lot of banks that come off of that. So, it makes sense to me to prevent bank rubs and to encourage getting things fixed ahead of time and to maintain that financial stability. So here is a little bit of perspective for you. The financial crisis was 2008, 2009. Obviously, it carried out a couple of extra years as far as the banking system goes. The peak number of banks that were on the problem bank list at one time was 888 banks. And we're talking 60 here. And of course, that was all about the financial crisis. But remember, this is a very official type of a list because it's maintained by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. So here's 2 or 3 more statistics. The peak, once again, in 2011, 888 banks. Crisis era between 2009 and 2012 had constantly 700 to 800 plus banks. And of course, recently we're at 50 to 60 banks. What does that mean? Well, it was about 1 in 9 U.S. banks were considered troubled by regulators. Today, the number is closer to about 1 to 2% of all banks, which is considered relatively healthy. Even at 188 banks, most of those banks did not fail. Many banks merged or were recapitalized. I mean, what this is for is an early warning system, not a failure list. So I would imagine that most banks that have failed were on that list at one point. So just keep that in mind. The FDIC has not stopped disclosing total assets of banks on the problem bank list because it has never publicly disclosed asset sizes for those specific banks in the first place. So you can look at the banking system as a whole and say, wow, 2% versus 50% are on the troubled bank list. And there's a big jump in there. So the problem bank list is confidential. It's an early warning signal. And they're never going to say XYZ Bank is in trouble. They're on the FDIC's list. And, I know that my bank is actually down the street on the toll road, and I can get there in 5 minutes. I would definitely think twice before leaving my money there in the event that I found out they were on this troubled bank list. So it's just, it's something, here's the other thing too, is that we've not had a big bank run during a time where people can easily have access to their money. I mean, all it takes is to go online and do a transaction and move your money from one place to another place. So keep all of that in mind. Now, tomorrow we're going to finish up this talk on where is a good place to put your money. We're going to talk about the 5 largest banks. Are those good places to look at? And what is it about those banks that make them a good choice for security and a lot of other things that you need to be aware of? So we'll talk about that tomorrow and cover some more of this information. Hey, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Listen, if you got a question for me, please go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com, and send it in, because we are all out of time. Until we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.